They said the dog was dangerous, but no one asked why he reacted the way he did. The town only saw the lunge. They did not see the training behind it. They did not see the war that never left him. 1 second, one sound, one reaction that changed everything. The dog obeyed every command. The man held the leash. And still, fear spread faster than the truth. Here is the question no one wanted to answer. If a dog is trained to protect at all costs, who is responsible when he does exactly that? They tried to judge the dog, but in the end, they were forced to judge themselves. This is not a story about danger. It is a story about loyalty, responsibility, and what happens when survival training meets everyday life. Stay with me, because what happened next was something the town never expected. Ashford Creek sat beneath a muted autumn sky, clouds hanging low after a night of rain. The streets were quiet, the air cool and metallic, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and fallen leaves. It was a town built on routine rather than curiosity, a place where people noticed change but preferred not to ask about it. That silence was what brought Lucas Hale here. Lucas arrived just after sunrise, driving an old pickup that bore the quiet wear of long distances. He was 42, tall and solidly built, his posture straight in a way that never softened, even when he stood still. His dark hair was cropped short, streaked with gray at the temples, and his face held the controlled stillness of a man long accustomed to vigilance. He wore a faded olive field jacket, a plain gray shirt beneath it, worn jeans, and heavy boots whose scuffed leather suggested years of use, far from ordinary roads. Lucas did not look like a man searching for a new beginning. He looked like someone trying to disappear without vanishing. When he opened the truck door, the dog stepped out first. Briggs was a German shepherd, 7 years old, large and powerfully built, his frame balanced between strength and restraint. His coat was a deep sable, dark across his back, lighter along his sides, with a thin scar above his right eye where fur never fully grew back. His ears stood erect, angled forward, catching sounds most people ignored. His eyes were dark and focused, holding no curiosity, no softness, only awareness. He did not wag his tail. He did not scan the street. He stood still, waiting. Lucas clipped the leash on with a practiced motion. The leash remained loose as they began walking, Briggs moving at Lucas's left side, perfectly aligned, neither pulling ahead nor falling behind. The dog's gait was measured and quiet, each step placed with intention. This was not the walk of a pet. It was the movement of a unit that had done this before, in places where hesitation meant death. A few people noticed them. Conversations slowed. Heads turned, then turned away again. The dog drew attention first, not because he barked or strained, but because he did nothing unnecessary. His stillness unsettled those who passed, as if he were watching something they could not see. Lucas felt the weight of those glances without returning them. He kept his eyes forward, his pace unchanged. He had learned long ago that acknowledgement invited questions, and questions led places he refused to revisit. They moved through town without stopping, the rhythm of their steps steady, controlled. Briggs's ears shifted occasionally, reacting to distant sounds, the clatter of metal, a door closing, a voice raised briefly before dropping again, but his body never broke formation. When a car passed too quickly, he adjusted half a step closer to Lucas, a subtle repositioning that spoke of training rather than fear. Lucas noticed it immediately. He always did. At the edge of town stood a small, weathered house, half hidden by trees beginning to thin for the season. Lucas unlocked the door and stepped inside, Briggs entering first and pausing just beyond the threshold. The dog surveyed the interior in silence, nose low, body tense, mapping the unfamiliar space. Only when he finished did he move aside, allowing Lucas to enter fully. Inside, the house was bare and cold, smelling faintly of dust and old wood. Lucas set his bag down and removed his jacket, resting it over the back of a chair. He sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely, his gaze unfocused. Briggs moved to the center of the room and sat, back straight, head high, alert but contained. He did not relax. Neither did Lucas. They stayed like that for several minutes, man and dog suspended in a silence that felt heavier indoors than it had outside. Lucas watched Briggs, his expression unreadable. There was trust there, absolute and unspoken, but also a quiet burden. Briggs was more than a companion. He was a reminder, a witness, the last constant from a life Lucas had not figured out how to leave behind. Lucas had believed that distance would help, that choosing a town like Ashford Creek would dull the edges of memory. But as the light dimmed slightly with the thickening clouds outside, he understood the flaw in that thinking. War did not end when you walked away from it. Sometimes it followed on 4 legs, silent and watchful, carrying every command it had ever been given. Outside, the town resumed its quiet routines, unaware of the weight that had just crossed its boundary. Inside, Briggs remained seated, eyes fixed on the door, as if guarding against something only he remembered. Lucas leaned back slightly, closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. The war had not stayed behind. It had arrived with them. The explosion came without warning. 1 second, the morning lay stretched and quiet. The next, it was ripped open by a violent crack from the construction site at the edge of town. Metal slammed against metal, followed by a shock wave that punched through the air and echoed off storefronts and parked cars. The sound was sharp, sudden, and absolute, leaving no room for preparation. Briggs reacted before the noise finished spreading. His body launched forward in a brutal surge, front paws striking the pavement as the leash snapped tight. The movement was explosive, driven by instinct, honed under pressure, not hesitation. His muscles locked, his spine lowered, and his center of gravity dropped hard toward the ground. A deep, savage growl tore from his chest, loud enough to cut through the chaos, vibrating with pure intent. He lunged again, harder. Briggs's head lowered, shoulders squared, teeth bared. His posture shifted completely, no trace of hesitation left in it. This was not alarm. This was engagement. His body aligned for forward drive, coiled and ready, as if the space between him and the construction site no longer existed. Lucas felt the leash yank violently through his hand. The force nearly pulled him off balance. His boot scraped against the pavement as he reacted on instinct, planting his feet and hauling back with everything he had. His arm burned as he shortened the leash in a single sharp motion, stepping into Briggs's space to cut the momentum before it could turn into a full charge. For a split second, Briggs did not yield. He strained against the restraint, growl deepening into something darker, more dangerous. His entire frame trembled with contained force, every muscle engaged, every instinct screaming forward. He was not panicking, he was not confused, he was locked in, focused, ready to move the moment restraint failed. Lucas's voice cut through the air, low and commanding. He called Briggs's name once. Briggs froze. The forward motion stopped mid-intent, as if a switch had been thrown. But the posture remained. His body stayed low, muscles rigid, teeth still exposed. His breathing came fast and harsh, eyes burning with unwavering focus toward the source of the blast. He was restrained, not calm. Around them, the street erupted. Someone screamed. A small dog barked wildly and bolted, its leash slipping from trembling hands. People stumbled backward, voices rising in overlapping bursts of fear. A man raised his hands instinctively, palms open as if facing something armed. No one moved closer. Distance spread fast. Phones appeared. People pointed. Lucas held his ground, grip locked tight, the leash biting into his palm as Briggs continued to vibrate with tension. He could feel the power beneath the dog's coat, the disciplined strength that had once been an asset, now fully exposed. He spoke again, slower this time, layering command with familiarity, grounding the sound in repetition rather than force. Seconds stretched thin. Briggs's growl began to fade, pulling back into his chest, though the tension did not leave his body. Slowly, with visible effort, he stepped back, returning to Lucas's side. He did not relax. He did not look away. He sat only when Lucas signaled him to, posture rigid, eyes locked forward. No one was hurt. No one lay on the ground. No blood stained the street. No attack had happened. But none of that mattered. From the construction site came hurried voices, explanations shouted over the ringing air. An accident, a pressure release, equipment failure. The words drifted outward, thin and ineffective, unable to erase what had just been seen. What remained was the image, the sudden lunge, the bared teeth, the sound of the growl, the leash stretched to its limit. Silence followed, heavy and uncertain. People stared openly now, fear hardening into judgment. Some looked at Briggs as if reassessing a threat they had not known existed. Others looked at Lucas, their expressions tight, calculating, already reaching conclusions. Lucas felt it settle in his chest, cold and familiar. Briggs had done exactly what he had been trained to do. He had identified danger and committed fully. He had stopped only because command intervened. Lucas tightened his grip on the leash and turned away. They walked back the way they had come, every step measured. Briggs stayed close, still alert, scanning the environment as if the threat might return at any moment. The tension did not leave him. It clung to his posture, his movements, his silence. Behind them, the town resumed its cautious motion, but the distance remained. Briggs had been controlled. He had obeyed. He had not attacked. But in that single, uncontained moment, he had crossed an invisible line. From that morning on, Briggs was no longer seen as a dog who could be trusted. Noah Reed stood where the noise had left him, long after the street began to breathe again. He was 20 years old, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with hands that always seemed marked by grease no matter how often he washed them. His hair fell into his eyes in careless waves, light brown and perpetually uncombed, and his clothes carried the smell of oil and metal from the garage where he apprenticed. People often mistook his quiet for indifference. It was not. Noah noticed things too carefully for his own good. He had seen everything, not from a distance, not through a phone screen, but from close enough to feel the vibration of the blast in his chest and hear the change in the dog's breath before the growl fully broke loose. He replayed the moment now with a precision that unsettled him. Briggs had not flailed or spun or barked wildly. The movement had been sharp, economical, frighteningly clean. The dog's body had aligned forward as if responding to an internal command, every muscle acting with purpose. There had been no confusion in it, no frenzy, only intent. That was the first thing Noah could not forget. The second was Lucas Hale. Most people had watched the dog. Noah had watched the man. He had seen the way Lucas's posture shifted in the same instant the leash went tight, how his boots scraped as he anchored himself, how his arm locked not in panic but in practiced response. And then, after the danger passed, Noah had seen something else, the brief tremor in Lucas's hand, the tightness in his jaw, the way his shoulders stayed rigid even as the dog stepped back into position. For a heartbeat, Lucas had looked like the one barely holding the line, as if the leash worked both ways. Noah started walking again, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, the image following him down the street. Around him, people talked in low, urgent voices. The story was already changing shape, rounding itself into something easier to digest. A dangerous dog, a man who could not control it, a near disaster. Each retelling shaved away detail and replaced it with certainty. Noah said nothing. At the garage he worked in silence, tightening bolts he had already tightened, wiping down tools that were already clean. His boss did not press him. Few people did. Noah had learned early that speaking too much invited questions he did not know how to answer. His father had taught him that lesson before leaving town for good, vanishing after one last argument that ended with a slammed door and words Noah never got to respond to. Since then, Noah had learned to keep things in, to let them settle, until they stopped demanding space. By late afternoon, the unease had not faded. It sat behind his ribs, insistent. He found himself walking toward the edge of town without fully deciding to. The house Lucas rented stood quiet beneath thinning trees, paint-weathered, yard unremarkable. Briggs sat near the porch, upright and still, eyes tracking movement down the road, with undiminished focus. Up close, the dog looked even larger than Noah remembered, his presence filling the space without movement. The scar above his eye caught the light, a thin, pale line against dark fur. Noah stopped a few steps away, uncertain. Briggs's ears shifted toward him, head turning slightly. There was no growl this time. No lunge, only attention. Noah felt his pulse quicken anyway. He raised his hand slowly, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement, the way one did when approaching something powerful and unpredictable. Briggs held his gaze, assessing, then looked back toward the road, interest already elsewhere. Lucas emerged from inside the house moments later. He looked older than he had that morning, the lines in his face deeper, his posture more guarded. His jacket hung open, his hands empty. When he saw Noah, he stopped. For a second, neither spoke. Noah cleared his throat. He had not planned words, and now that the moment arrived, they resisted being shaped. Lucas studied him quietly, eyes steady, unreadable. Briggs remained seated, a silent presence between them. "I saw what happened," Noah said finally. His voice sounded thinner than he expected. Lucas did not ask what he meant. Noah shifted his weight, glancing briefly at the dog before forcing himself to continue. He wasn't out of control, not really. I mean, it was fast, scary, but it was controlled. Lucas's jaw tightened. "That's not how it looked." Noah nodded. "I know." The silence that followed was heavy, not hostile, but cautious. Lucas leaned back against the porch rail, crossing his arms loosely, a posture that suggested distance rather than defense. Noah noticed the faint tremor still present in Lucas's hands, subtle enough to miss unless you were looking for it. "I also saw you," Noah added, before he could stop himself. "After you pulled him back." Lucas's eyes flicked up sharply. Noah felt a surge of regret, but pressed on. "You were shaking, just for a second." Lucas looked away, his gaze settling somewhere past the trees. When he spoke, his voice was flat. "You shouldn't have seen that." Noah swallowed. "I'm not saying it to anyone." That was the truth, and it was the problem. If Noah spoke, if he told people what he had seen, he could change the story. He could explain the difference between chaos and training, between a dog losing its mind and a dog following it too well. He could say that Lucas had not panicked, that the control had been real, earned, drilled into muscle and bone. But he could also expose the crack beneath it, the shake, the moment where Lucas looked like he was holding more than a leash. Noah understood what that kind of exposure could do. He had watched his mother's strength harden into distance after his father left, watched how a single moment could reshape how people were seen. Once a weakness was named, it never truly left. Lucas straightened slightly. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You saw what you saw." Noah hesitated. "If I talk, it might help him." He nodded toward Briggs. "But it might hurt you." Lucas met his gaze again, something like surprise flickering there before settling into resignation. "That's not your responsibility." Noah knew that was not entirely true. Responsibility had a way of attaching itself to witnesses, whether they wanted it or not. Briggs shifted then, standing smoothly, moving closer to Lucas's side. He did not touch him. He simply aligned, a familiar formation reestablished. Noah watched the movement, understanding deepening with discomfort. The dog was not guarding Lucas from Noah. He was grounding him. Noah took a step back. "I'm not saying anything yet," he said, "but I won't lie either." Lucas nodded once. It was not gratitude. It was acknowledgement. As Noah walked away, the weight followed him. He had seen the truth split in two. On one side was a dog whose reaction made sense if you understood it. On the other was a man whose control came at a cost people would not forgive if they saw it clearly. Protecting one might mean exposing the other. Behind him, Briggs sat again, eyes returning to the road. Lucas remained still, watching the space Noah left behind. Noah reached the end of the street and stopped, looking back once more. The house stood quiet, ordinary, hiding nothing and everything at once. He realized then that silence was no longer neutral. It was a choice. Eleanor Finch had learned to respect silence, not the empty kind, but the silence that followed a disturbance when people stopped speculating and began looking for something solid to hold on to. The library felt different that afternoon. Quieter, but not calmer. Conversations ended sooner. Footsteps lingered near the front desk longer than usual. The town had already seen what it needed to see. Now it wanted language to justify what it felt. The box from the county records office arrived without ceremony. Public files, routine transfers, nothing marked urgent. Eleanor signed for it, carried it behind the desk, and continued her work until the last patron left. Only then did she open the lid and begin sorting through the folders with deliberate care. She had handled enough records to know when something mattered. Weight was not the indicator. Clarity was. One file stood out for its restraint. Few pages, no commentary, dates, classifications, signatures. Eleanor read through it once without stopping. Then she slowed, attention narrowing, eyes moving with precision rather than habit. The line appeared near the bottom of the page. High-intensity response under combat stimulus. Eleanor did not react. She read it again, then once more, as if repetition might soften its edges. It did not accuse, it did not warn. It described a condition without context, stripped of origin or outcome. In isolation, it meant very little. Eleanor understood that immediately. She also understood that isolation would not last. The memory of the construction site returned uninvited. The sound, the sudden movement, the dog's body dropping low, the leash drawn tight, the way the street had recoiled as one. The sentence on the page aligned too easily with what people believed they had witnessed. Not proof, but confirmation. Eleanor closed the folder and rested her hands on the cover. She had seen this pattern before, not with soldiers or animals, but with people whose lives narrowed after a phrase escaped its proper boundaries. Words like these did not declare guilt. They authorized process. They allowed fear to dress itself as responsibility. The library clock marked the passing minutes. Outside, the light shifted as clouds thickened. Eleanor returned the file to the stack and carried it to the reference table, setting it down with care. Public record was not something she could interfere with, nor would she have tried. Her role was not to decide outcomes. It was to recognize when they were already forming. Later, while shelving returned books near the front windows, Eleanor saw Lucas Hale across the street. He stood near the grocery, the leash looped around his hand, Briggs seated beside him. The dog remained motionless, posture rigid, eyes tracking the street with unwavering focus. Nothing about Briggs suggested chaos, and yet Eleanor could feel the distance people kept as they passed. It was subtle, practiced, already learned. Lucas looked outwardly composed, but Eleanor noticed what others did not. The way his attention never fully rested. The way his shoulders remained set, as if braced for a second impact that might never come. Briggs stayed close, aligned, not guarding, but anchoring. Eleanor did not cross the street. Intervention without necessity often hardened positions. Instead, she watched long enough to understand what had changed. The town no longer saw a man walking a dog. It saw a risk being managed. Back inside, Eleanor placed the file where it belonged, cataloged and accessible. She did not flag it. She did not highlight the line. She knew she would not need to. Someone would ask. Someone always did. Fear preferred official language, and official language was already waiting. As evening approached, Eleanor remained at her desk, reading without absorbing words. The sentence repeated itself in her mind, heavy with implication. High-intensity response under combat stimulus. Accurate, perhaps. Complete? No. But completeness had never been a requirement for consequence. She understood what would follow, not accusation, not punishment, evaluation, review. A request framed as precaution. No one would claim they were condemning anything. They would say they were being careful. They would say it was procedure. Eleanor locked the library at closing time and stood for a moment on the steps, the air cool against her face. Ashford Creek looked unchanged, orderly, restrained. Yet beneath that surface, something had shifted. The town now possessed a sentence it could point to. That was often enough. That night, Eleanor slept poorly. The line returned again and again, not because it was false, but because it lacked the balance of explanation. It described a response without acknowledging training, purpose, or restraint. It reduced complexity to a category, and categories were easier to manage than people. By morning, Eleanor accepted what she already knew. The moment had passed when the incident could remain just an incident. The words had given it weight. Whether or not anyone acted immediately, a process had begun, one that rarely reversed itself once it found language to support it. Eleanor returned to the library and resumed her routine. Shelving, sorting, answering questions. No one mentioned the file. No one needed to. The sentence was already circulating in quieter ways, shaping conclusions without being spoken aloud. She looked once more toward the road leading out of town, where Lucas Hale and Briggs lived at the edge of visibility. Eleanor understood then that the most decisive act had not been the explosion or the lunge. It had been the writing of a single line, patient and precise, waiting years for the right moment to be read. The complaint did not come with confrontation. It arrived quietly, folded into routine, carried by careful language that avoided blame while fixing responsibility in place. By the time Lucas Hale became aware of it, the matter had already shifted beyond personal opinion and into procedure. No one said seizure. No one said removal. They spoke instead of evaluation, review, and precaution. Lucas stood inside his small house, the notice resting on the table, where light from the window caught its edges. Briggs sat beside him, posture straight, alert without agitation. The dog did not sense danger in the room. That distinction belonged only to humans. The complaint summarized what had been seen, not what had been prevented. Aggressive posture, forward lunge, public concern. At the bottom, the next step was outlined with calm efficiency. A mandatory behavioral evaluation would be scheduled through the county. Until then, observation and restraint in public spaces. Lucas read the page once. He did not need to read it again. He felt no anger. That absence unsettled him more than rage would have. What settled in his chest instead was fear, cold and exact. Not fear of authority, but of consequence. He understood the logic immediately. If Briggs were judged incapable of control in a civilian environment, the outcome would not be temporary. It would be final. He looked at the dog. Briggs met his gaze briefly, then returned his attention to the window, ears shifting at distant sounds. Still vigilant. Still correct by the rules he had been taught. Lucas exhaled slowly. Briggs had done nothing wrong. That was the problem. In war, the response had been right. Speed had meant survival. Commitment had been rewarded. Hesitation had been punished. Lucas had trained Briggs for that world, refined those instincts, trusted them with his life. He had never trained Briggs for sidewalks and sudden noises that did not require engagement. The knock at the door came later, measured and brief. A woman from the town office explained the process without accusation. Her tone was neutral, her posture professional. She spoke of procedure, not judgment. When she finished, she waited. Lucas did not argue. "I understand," he said. The woman nodded, visibly relieved, and left. That night, Lucas walked the yard with Briggs at his side, the leash held shorter than before. Not because Briggs needed it, but because Lucas did. Every movement of the dog drew his attention now. Every shift weighted with meaning. The partnership had not changed, but the lens through which it was seen had. As darkness settled, Lucas sat inside with his back against the wall, Briggs lying nearby, eyes open, breathing steady. Lucas rested a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the familiar strength beneath his palm. "You were right," he said quietly, not expecting an answer. Briggs remained still. Lucas understood then why he had not protested. Arguing would not change what had already been set in motion. The process would move forward whether he resisted or complied. Resistance would confirm fear. Compliance might, at least, buy time. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of Briggs's breathing. The town slept, unaware of the line that had been crossed. Not a line of violence, but of interpretation. The moment when correctness became unacceptable. The process had begun, and Lucas knew exactly what was at stake. The knife moved first. It was not a wide, reckless swing this time, but a sudden, sharp motion driven by panic and rage colliding at once. The man lunged toward Brutus, the blade cutting through the air in a tight arc, aimed low and fast, as if instinct had finally overridden whatever restraint he had left. The sound of metal slicing air was brief, almost delicate, but it carried through the room with terrible clarity. Brutus did not flinch. He shifted his weight to absorb what was coming, muscles tightening, body ready to explode forward at the smallest permission. His eyes locked onto the blade, tracking its path with absolute precision. The distance between steel and fur collapsed to inches. Nathan moved. He did not shout Brutus's name. He did not call attention to himself. He stepped into the moment the way he had stepped into countless others before, calm and exact, his body already ahead of his thoughts. One foot slid forward, cutting the angle the man had created, his shoulder turning just enough to take him out of the knife's direct line. His hand struck the attacker's wrist with controlled force. Not a punch, not a blow meant to punish. A precise impact designed to disrupt grip and balance. The man cried out as pain shot up his arm, his fingers spasming. The knife loosened but did not fall. Nathan followed without hesitation. He closed the distance in a single step, his other hand locking around the man's forearm while his shoulder drove inward, collapsing the attacker's posture. The motion was fluid, practiced, stripped of excess. There was no wasted movement, no anger behind it, only intent. The knife clattered to the floor. The sound rang out, loud and final, echoing across the restaurant like a bell signaling the end of something dangerous. Several people screamed again, not from fear this time, but from release. Nathan did not stop. He guided the man down, rotating his arm just enough to force compliance without breaking bone. The attacker's knees buckled, his body folding under the sudden loss of control. Nathan lowered him to the ground, maintaining pressure, pinning the arm securely against the man's back. The movement was firm but measured, a balance between authority and restraint. Brutus stood inches away. His body remained tense, every muscle ready, but he did not attack. He watched Nathan's hands, the position of the man's shoulders, the angle of the pinned arm. The dog understood what was happening, not in human terms, but in outcomes. The threat was being neutralized. The line had held. The man struggled briefly, shouting incoherently, his free hand scraping against the floor. Nathan adjusted his weight, shifting just enough to remove leverage. His voice came low and steady, directed not to the room, but to the man beneath him. "Stay down." There was no threat in the words, no promise of violence, only certainty. The man's resistance weakened, his breathing ragged, panic draining into exhaustion. He lay still, chest heaving, eyes wild but unfocused, now that control had been stripped away. Around them, the restaurant was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. People stood frozen in the aftermath, trying to understand how chaos had collapsed into stillness so quickly. A woman covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling freely. A man near the wall lowered himself slowly into a chair, his legs shaking too hard to remain standing. The young woman near the counter stumbled backward, finally free to move. She leaned against the edge of a table, one hand gripping its surface as if the world might tilt without it. Her face was streaked with tears, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. She stared at the scene on the floor, disbelief and shock fighting for dominance. Then her eyes found Brutus. The dog turned his head slightly, checking her position, confirming distance and safety. Satisfied, he relaxed by a fraction, the rigid tension easing just enough to signal that the immediate danger had passed. Sarah was already at the young woman's side. Her hands were gentle but firm as she guided her toward a chair, speaking softly, grounding her with simple instructions to breathe, to sit, to stay present. Sarah's own hands trembled slightly, adrenaline still flooding her system, but her voice remained calm. Years of caring for others in moments of distress rose to the surface now, overriding her fear. Behind the counter, Derek stared in stunned silence. He had watched the entire exchange unfold in seconds, yet it felt like minutes stretched thin. The authority he usually relied on had been useless. It was control, not command, that had ended the threat. The realization sat heavy in his chest, humbling and unsettling. Nathan remained where he was, one knee pressed into the floor, one hand securing the attacker's arm. He did not look around for approval or acknowledgement. His focus stayed on the man beneath him, on maintaining pressure without escalation. He adjusted his grip once, subtly, ensuring circulation was not cut off, that pain did not become injury. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance. The sound grew louder with each passing second, threading through the stillness like a promise. Someone sobbed quietly near the back of the room. Another person whispered a prayer under their breath. Brutus sat down slowly. It was a deliberate choice, not fatigue. He positioned himself beside Nathan, body angled toward the rest of the room, eyes scanning faces and movements. His posture communicated readiness without aggression, a silent assurance that the situation remained under control. The man on the floor stopped struggling entirely. His breathing slowed, his head turned to the side, defeat settling in where fury had been moments before. Nathan held him there, not out of cruelty, but out of responsibility. Letting go too soon would invite chaos back in. When the police finally arrived, their voices cut through the quiet with practiced authority. Nathan did not resist them. He followed instructions calmly, releasing the man only when hands replaced his own, when control passed cleanly from one set of trained professionals to another. He stood up slowly, stepped back, and retrieved the knife with his foot, sliding it away from everyone before kicking it further out of reach. Brutus rose with him, staying close, eyes alert, but no longer burning. As the attacker was pulled to his feet and led away, still shouting but powerless now, the room exhaled. People sank into chairs, clutched one another, wiped tears from their faces. Shock lingered, but fear began to loosen its grip. Nathan did not seek the young woman's gaze. He did not need thanks. He did not expect it. His eyes went instead to Brutus, meeting the dog's steady stare for a brief moment. Nothing passed between them that anyone else could see, but the understanding was complete. The threat had been stopped, the line had held, and no life had been taken to make that happen. The sound of sirens faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that had come before it. The restaurant no longer trembled with fear, but it had not yet returned to life. People remained seated where they were, shoulders slumped, hands still shaking, as if movement itself required permission. The air smelled faintly of sweat and metal, and every breath felt deliberate. Nathan stood near his table, no longer crouched, no longer engaged, yet not relaxed. His posture was upright, balanced, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The adrenaline had drained from his system with the same efficiency it had arrived, leaving behind a familiar emptiness. Brutus remained close to his leg, seated now, calm but alert, his ears occasionally turning as voices murmured in low tones around them. The young woman who had been trapped near the counter sat with Sarah beside her. She was still 18, still shaken, her hands wrapped tightly around a glass of water she had not yet managed to drink. Her breathing had slowed, though each inhale carried a faint tremor. Sarah stayed close, one arm resting lightly against the back of the chair, her presence steady and unintrusive. Years earlier, after a car accident that had taken a close friend, Sarah had learned that comfort was not about words, but about staying when others felt the urge to flee. That instinct guided her now. Derek Moore stood behind the counter, staring at nothing in particular. At 36, he had never felt older. His hands rested flat against the surface, fingers spread, grounding himself in the solidness of it. He replayed the last few minutes over and over in his mind, each time reaching the same realization. He had been in charge. And yet, when the moment demanded action, authority had meant nothing. It was restraint, experience, and discipline that had saved the room. He looked toward Nathan. For the first time since the man had entered earlier that evening, Derek did not see a problem to solve. He saw someone who had carried responsibility without being asked, someone who had stepped forward not to be seen, but because someone had to. The discomfort Derek had felt earlier now twisted into something sharper. Shame. Derek stepped out from behind the counter and walked toward Nathan, his movements slower than before, stripped of the rigid confidence he usually carried. People noticed and fell silent again, sensing that another important moment was unfolding. When Derek stopped a few feet away, he hesitated. Words, which usually came easily to him in his role, felt heavy now. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, his voice low, rough around the edges. "For earlier, for how I handled things." Nathan looked at him calmly. There was no anger in his expression, no satisfaction, just attention. Derek swallowed and continued, the words coming more steadily now that he had begun. He spoke about the assumptions he had made, about the pressure he felt to keep control, about how fear had disguised itself as authority. He did not excuse himself. He did not ask for forgiveness. He simply acknowledged what had been wrong. Nathan listened without interrupting. When Derek finished, the silence returned, but it was different this time. Less brittle, less charged. "You did what you thought you had to," Nathan said at last. His voice was quiet even. "So did I." It was not absolution, it was understanding. Derek nodded, a tightness easing from his chest that he hadn't realized was there. He glanced down at Brutus, who looked back at him steadily, not hostile, not warm, just present. "That dog," Derek said, choosing his words carefully. He knew before anyone else. Brutus blinked once, slow and deliberate. "He's trained to notice when things shift," Nathan replied. "Before people admit they have." Derek let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though no humor touched it. He nodded again and stepped back, giving Nathan space he now understood had been earned, not demanded. Across the room, the young woman finally stood. Her movements were tentative, as if the floor beneath her might still be unreliable. Sarah rose with her, staying close, but not guiding, allowing the girl to move under her own strength. When their eyes met Nathan's, the young woman hesitated, then spoke. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice trembled, but it held. Nathan met her gaze and nodded once. He did not tell her she was safe now. He did not reassure her with promises. He knew better than to offer certainty where none existed. His acknowledgment was simple, respectful. Brutus shifted slightly, as if sensing the exchange, then settled again. Gradually, the restaurant began to breathe. People spoke in low tones, recounting what they had seen, checking on one another. A man helped a woman to her feet. Someone laughed nervously, the sound breaking and then catching again. Life did not resume all at once. It stitched itself back together slowly, unevenly. Sarah returned to the counter and poured herself a glass of water, her hands finally steady enough to trust. She looked toward Nathan and Brutus one last time, a quiet gratitude in her expression, shaped by recognition rather than awe. She had seen fear many times before. She had rarely seen it answered with such restraint. Nathan gathered his jacket and rested a hand briefly against Brutus's shoulder. The dog rose at once, calm, composed, the tension of the night draining from his body without leaving chaos behind. Together they moved toward the exit, not hurried, not lingering. As they passed the tables, conversations paused. Some people looked away, embarrassed. Others watched openly, their expressions changed by what they had witnessed. Nathan did not acknowledge the attention. He had never learned how to carry it comfortably. At the door, Derek spoke again, softer this time. "You're welcome here," he said. "Both of you." Nathan paused, then nodded. Outside, the night air was cool and quiet, the street lights reflecting off damp pavement. The door closed behind them, sealing the noise and the memory inside. Brutus walked at Nathan's side, his pace even, his focus relaxed now that the threat was gone. Nathan took a long breath, one he had been holding since the moment the knife had appeared, and let it out slowly. Understanding hadn't come through force. It had come through control. And that, Nathan knew, was the only kind that lasted. Briggs was not taken away. The decision was clear and restrained. He would remain in Ashford Creek under a high-risk classification. Supervised movement, mandatory reintegration training, regular evaluations, no language of forgiveness, only conditions. Lucas Hale accepted them without protest. Briggs entered the training program as he entered everything else. Alert, responsive, consistent. The work did not ask him to become something new. It asked him to delay, to wait, to recognize that not every sound or movement required engagement. The difficulty was not obedience. Briggs had always obeyed. The difficulty was restraint. Lucas stayed in town. He did not look for somewhere quieter. He did not argue for exemptions. He recognized, without resistance, that the process applied to him as much as it did to the dog. If Briggs needed to learn how to live outside of war, so did he. They trained together in different ways. Briggs learned to pause where instinct demanded action. Lucas learned to stand down where memory demanded readiness. Progress was measured in seconds, a delayed step, a held position, a moment where nothing happened and nothing was lost. Briggs remained vigilant. That did not change. Lucas carried his memories. That did not fade. What changed was isolation. They were no longer managing danger alone. The town did not erase risk, but it allowed space for correction. The leash stayed loose but present. Boundaries were clear. Expectations were enforced. That was enough. This was not pardon, it was permission. Not to forget who they were, but to learn how to exist differently in a world that asked for restraint instead of response. And for the first time since leaving the war behind, Lucas and Briggs were allowed to learn that lesson together. This story was never really about a dog or a rule or a town. It was about grace. Briggs was not broken. Lucas was not dangerous. They were simply trained for a world that no longer existed. And sometimes that is how life feels for many of us. We react the way we were taught to survive. We protect ourselves the way we once had to. We carry habits and fears from old battles into new seasons that ask for peace instead of defense. In the Bible, God often does not remove the storm immediately. He teaches His people how to walk through it without being destroyed. This was not a miracle where everything was erased. It was a miracle of mercy. The kind where God says, "I will not take you away from this world, but I will walk with you while you learn how to live in it again." Lucas stayed. Briggs stayed, not because they were perfect, but because they were willing to learn. That is how God works in everyday life. He does not always change our past. He changes our future by giving us another chance to grow. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may still be fighting a war inside. Leave a comment below and write Amen if you believe second chances are a gift from God. Subscribe to the channel so we can continue telling stories of hope, healing, and quiet courage. May God bless you. May He protect those who are still learning how to live in peace. And may He walk beside you as patiently as He walked beside Lucas and Briggs. Amen.